Good evening, everybody. This month's presentation is co-sponsored by Bivival. And when I say co-sponsored, it doesn't mean there's any money changing hands for anybody involved here. This is all a volunteer effort. Anyway, Bivival is an organization focusing on death literacy, the emotional and financial impacts of death, and preparing for the end of life. They have an interesting website that can be accessed at bevival.com. That's BEVIVAL.com. Third Thursday is a consortium of 5 environmental conservation commissions in Ulster County that do this the third Thursday of every month at 6:30 p.m. on a topic involving some issue concerning environmental conservation. Our speaker for tonight is Arif Khan, who will be talking today about green burials as an alternative to typical contemporary Western burial methods and funeral customs like embalming and the use of non-biodegradable caskets. It's an approach to caring for the dead with minimal environmental impact that aids in the conservation of natural resources, reduction of carbon emissions, and the restoration and/or preservation of habitat. Arif grew up in the Hudson Valley and currently lives in the town of Shamgum. Though his primary field of expertise is urban planning, he has a strong interest in the subject of death and views it as a way to inspire greater appreciation for life. Arif currently works since 2018 as a freelance strategic planning consultant, for which he has a long list of impressive credits on his LinkedIn page. Prior to his work in strategic planning, Arif was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, a humanitarian affairs officer at the United Nations in New York City, and a director of Humanitarian Resources International. He also has worked as a disaster response manager, volunteer firefighter, and restaurateur. Please hold your questions to the end of Arif's talk. Welcome, Arif.
Hi. Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alan, and everyone else from the Third Thursday group, and thanks for joining us. We are going to talk about green burials. Let's see if this works. Do you see my screen?
Not yet.
No? How about now?
Let's see.
Yes, no?
No, not yet. Screen share.
Thought I activated that. Nothing, huh? Share screen.
Alan, do you know what's going on?
There we go. I think I know what's going on.
Oh, all right.
But now.
There we go.
All right. Okay. I think every Zoom call has to have a little bit of technical difficulty.
Yes.
Keep us on our toes. All right. So great. Yeah. Thank you for having me. My name is Arif. I live in the town of Shamgum. And I'm going to be talking about green burials and conservation burial grounds and other options for end-of-life care, what's called death care. I will disclose that I am by no means an expert at this, but I have a strong interest. And I agreed when Michael invited me to talk about this. I think I told him I'm not an expert, but I'm happy to talk with others about end-of-life and green burial options because I like the topic. I actually find it inspiring and like a good reminder of our mortality. And I do have friends that are experts. One friend, Michael Hebb, I don't know if you can see this book, but it's probably backwards. He wrote this book, Let's Talk About Death. And since I'm talking about death, I think his book was very successful. He actually started a movement that got over 1 million people having dinner conversations around the topic of death. When I had a restaurant, I hosted him and we had conversations there. And now I guess I'm continuing the conversation here and talking about green burials. If you saw the Barbie movie, you know this moment in the movie at a party where Barbie asks her friends, do you ever think about dying? The party comes to a complete halt, and then Barbie backs away from the existential question. But it does lead Barbie on this great journey of self-discovery. And like I mentioned, I find talking about death brings more meaning in my life. So like Barbie, I often think about death, and I'm guessing if you guys are here for this conversation, you do think about death a lot too. So I'm also interested in my connection to the natural world, trying to simplify my life in some ways, but trying to find where I fit in the natural world, which led me to the topic of green burials. So those two things intertwined. And I'm guessing if you're here to hear about green burials, the idea of being buried in a steel casket like this in a concrete vault in an overly manicured lawn filled with, well, your body filled with formaldehyde is not appealing to you. So I'm here to present some other options, which I feel like do not represent the current modern industry of funerals, which I find are expensive, overly commodified, and maybe devoid of a connection to the natural world. Let me just. So first, oh, I lost my control. There we go. A bit of history to how we got to our modern funeral industry. And actually, embalming was not popular in the US until the Civil War. Large number of deaths in the Civil War in the mid-late 1800s required bodies to be transported from, we'll say, enemy lines back to their homes over long distances. So it gave rise to both the carriage industry and transporting of bodies, and also the embalming industry, which gave rise to this professionalism of death care or funeral directors. And it was actually Abe Lincoln, after his death, he was brought on a tour from Washington, D.C. to his home in Illinois to be buried, and he was embalmed by the leading embalmers of the day. And this gave rise to the popularity and kind of shifted the culture around embalming. You could say he was an influencer in that field, besides his many other contributions, ending slavery, one. But he also influenced people on the use of embalming. So in addition to embalming, I'll speak about some of the environmental impacts. I mean, embalming itself is largely, so it's a complex process where blood is drained from some of your arterial systems, from your veins, and fluid is replaced with formaldehyde, water, and a number of other chemicals. And formaldehyde, you might know, is carcinogenic, harmful to humans. So it has, and it's harmful to soil and animals. So the formaldehyde, let's see, I think I have 4.3 million gallons of formaldehyde-based embalming fluid are used every year in the US. So it's bad for, as I mentioned, for soil, groundwater, and also the humans dealing with it. The funeral home directors, undertakers, who do the body embalming. So, and it's also not necessary. A lot of people think it's necessary for hygienic reasons or legal reasons, but it is in general not necessary. It doesn't prevent the spread of disease, or it's not required in any way. The other environmental aspect are the caskets and vaults. I've got stats: 1.6 million tons of concrete, 20 million board feet of hardwoods, 64,000 tons of steel are buried in the US each year. That is good for folks in the funeral industry who are selling caskets and other things. But to me, it does not seem like a good use of resources. The other aspect is land use. A lot of cemeteries are used for single purpose. And as you see in the picture on the left, concrete vaults, filling cemeteries, which are typically monoculture of lawns, which require care and maintenance, did not provide habitat for living humans or animals. So that's the other aspect of it. So you might ask, well, what about cremation? So cremation is actually growing in popularity. It's actually just peaking up about 50%, a little over 50% of people are now choosing cremation. It has a lower carbon footprint, and obviously it does not take the land use and the space to dispose of ashes or remains. So in that way, it's a better environmental choice. But obviously, for cremation, you need a lot of heat, typically up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours. So you do have an impact as far as burning of fossil fuels and emissions and particulates and CO2. So there is some impact, but it's not as great as, say, um, I would say, the modern burial. And before I get to the options of the green burial, I figured I'd establish the laws. We are in New York State, and I got to discover a lot about these laws in my research. But in New York State, it's one of 3 states that requires a funeral director, a licensed funeral director. So that means anything that happens with your body or your loved one's bodies and after death requires the involvement of a funeral director. Caskets are not required. So there are some states that caskets are required. They are not. You can be buried in a shroud or a cardboard box. Human composting as of 2022 has been allowed. There's only a few states that allow that. Katrina Spade in Seattle and another woman in the state of California who's an activist lobbied for this, and they're working across the country to legalize human composting, and I'll get to that, how that differs. The other thing that people don't know about is home burial in New York State is allowed. It's not allowed in every state, but according to the state, you are allowed to be buried if you have a backyard and a property that's away from a water source. You are allowed to be buried there. New York is a home rule state, which means that local jurisdictions, if you've ever dealt with any kind of zoning thing or addition to your property, you'll know that there's a planning board and a zoning board of your town or city or village. So they do have the ability to put restrictions on that. It's interesting, I've called a number of jurisdictions and it seems like there's a lot of gray area in this. So I can get into more detail about that in a bit. Use the same graphic, but I thought it would be useful to have a framework for your own decision making. And this is kind of, I guess you would say, what I would use for my decisions when I'm thinking about this. One is, what are your personal wishes? For me, I expressed that I wanted to do something that was simple. And I already expressed how I thought burying steel and hardwoods in a concrete vault is wasteful. So I'm trying to go with a minimal resource use approach. But there's also the impact you have on loved ones, your relatives and your friends that will be living. And you could look at it in 2 ways. You can look at it as reducing the burdens, but also maybe maximizing the positive impact. Assuming your loved ones will actually be missing you, you could, create a ceremony around your burial that honors your passing and eases any suffering that might happen. And then, of course, there's religious and cultural context. I know with Judaism and Islam, it's typically shrouds are used, and I don't think they go with cremation, whereas Buddhists and Hindus are more into cremation. The costs, of course, the costs can be debilitating of getting sick in this country, and also extremely high in death. And at your time of grieving, and I've dealt with this, you will have folks maybe in the funeral home trying to sell you things, and I'm not saying all funeral home directors are like this. Many are very principled and ethical, but there's this kind of equating the amount of money you spend with how much you loved the person who's passed. So you can weigh the different costs of the different approaches. And then we're talking mostly here about environmental impact, and I've broken that into different categories of land use, the chemical pollution, how many resources are being consumed, and then you can think about emissions, both from the disposition of your body, but also in travel, depending on where you want to be buried or cremated or even composted, there will be emissions related to that. So this is just a framework for thinking about the different options. And I definitely don't want to push one option over another. Of course, my opinions might come through in my presentation, but I think this is everyone's personal choice, what feels best to them and their family. So I laid out on how this diagram works. It goes from left to right of the green and to the less green. And on top of the arrow are the more typical approaches. Maybe the first one is less typical, but I'll explain that. And below the arrow is a lot less typical, but still possible. So we'll start with above the arrow. On the left, it's a bunch of folks in a conservation burial ground digging a grave, maybe for one of the people present digging. And it's as green as you can get. There's no excavator use, just human shovels. And I suppose you can further reduce your footprint by having a vegetarian or vegan diet to power your shovel use. But that will be your greenest of options. And I would say a home burial would be your greenest of options, and then perhaps a conservation burial ground or a natural burial ground would be your next greenest. And then the middle top would be cremation, and then the right would be the modern burial in a casket. Below the arrow, from the left, I have a water burial, which I discovered was legal. You can be buried offshore 3 nautical miles from the shore, and I think it has to be 600 feet deep. So you have to get to a place where there's 600 feet, yeah, of the surface of the ocean. So, and then that bottom middle option is a photo from the composting facility called Recompose in Seattle. And the woman, Katrina Spade, was an architect, and she came up with this idea and she was looking at minimizing the use of land for burials. So she came up with this indoor composting facility. And they are active. And like I mentioned, composting of human bodies has become legal in New York State. I think they are planning to expand here. I don't know if there's an actual composting, or I should say indoor composting facility, which will turn your body into about a cubic yard of garden soil amendments, basically, using wood chips and straw. And on the bottom right, the somewhat scary looking tube is aquamation, also known as water cremation. It's been used in England and a few other countries and is starting to get use in the US. It's a greener alternative to, and maybe I should have shifted over. It's a greener alternative to cremation. It uses alkaline water and high pressure and lower heat to reduce your remains. So it uses about a quarter of the energy as cremation. And then I don't know if anyone recognizes this, but I didn't mention this. This is from a TED Talk. Artist J. Rim Lee presented this idea of a mushroom burial suit. I don't know if anyone has heard of this. It got 1.8 million views, and it was very inspiring. The unfortunate thing is that it doesn't work. Lee's idea was to embed the suit with spores and mycelium and possibly growing mushrooms that would remediate the soil and any toxins associated with the body. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. So she's an artist, and I'm thankful for her for that presentation because I think it got a lot of people to think about alternatives to typical burial. So the other option I didn't show, I don't know if anyone would be able to identify this, but this is what's called a Tibetan sky funeral. It's used in Tibet, and you'd see vultures. I think a body is taken to a place where the vultures pick the body apart. And if you live in a rural area around here, you're familiar with deer carcasses being consumed by turkey vultures, and they do a great job. Unfortunately, this is not legal in the US, or I don't know, fortunately, maybe we don't want random bodies being strewn around. So yeah, this is not legal in the US. All right, so let's get to aspects of green burial. I should check in because I'm not getting any feedback from folks and I don't really see anyone, but am I going at a fine pace, or do you want me to slow down, speed up? Is this useful?
I think that's a fine pace, Arif, what you're doing now.
Okay, great.
I agree.
Okay. Good. So then I will continue. So green burial. Green burial does not use embalming fluid or a burial vault. Instead, the remains are placed directly in the earth, and the idea is for the body to decompose naturally. And the idea would being it has a minimal negative impact on the environment, and actually a positive one, as far as soil health and maintaining local habitat for flora and fauna. There are options in green burial. As far as your casket, there's options like I mentioned, a shroud could be used as long as it's natural material and biodegrades. A wicker basket like this one, which is a more traditional burial, a wood non-treated, or even a cardboard casket. Any of these may be used as long as they're biodegradable. So there's variations in depending on your personal preference or your family's preference. But the basic principles of green burial is that you're having minimum impact, you're reducing carbon emissions, you're also protecting worker health, and you're contributing possibly to restoration or preservation of habitat. And I mentioned the green burial at home as the most eco-friendly option if you have property that could be used. And I should mention that an easement may be required on your property. This is up to your local jurisdiction, but this would prevent anyone from building on the site. And anyone can dedicate a family burial plot up to 3 acres in New York State. And then there's a tax benefit if you dedicate say a 3-acre plot to a family burial site. It is exempt from property taxes. And from what I understand, most rural towns allow cemeteries as a special use in residential and agricultural, or I should say residential agricultural properties. So this is something that you would check with your town. You could start with your town clerk. Often they may not know, and then go to your building department to ask. And of course, they might be shocked at first, but it depends on the town. I called a few towns. One person knew of a burial, but she forgot the rules. The other one had to get back to me. And I did actually speak to a funeral director, and he said there's a lot of gray area, whereas a lot of towns don't actually have rules about it, but they know they're not allowed to restrict it. So in my mind, gray area is a good thing. And I mentioned the composting, which has been recently legalized as far as indoor composting. To the left is the actual facility in Seattle, and to the right is actual remains. And about the process, what Katrina uses there at Recompose is a mix of wood chips and straw. And it takes about 5 to 7 weeks. That's when bacteria, nematodes, and various fungi get to work decomposing your body. And then I think they do a turning and then a curing process. So it's about a 2-month process to convert your body to the usable Garden Amendment. And so you end up with about between 500 to 1,000 pounds of this compost. It's a cubic yard, and if just to help you understand, it's about a Toyota Tacoma pickup load, like a 6-foot bed, so a small pickup load of usable soil. So for me, I see the advantage of this is if you don't have access to property, and I don't know, you want to share something, give a gift that'll keep giving, I suppose. And they have a program where they actually, if you don't want to take that cubic yard of remains, that they have properties that they donate the remains to and amend the soil. And so it's actually they're connected with habitat restoration. So it's a nice way to give. I mentioned the water burial. This might not be practical for most folks here, but it is a legal option. And then the scary water cremation alkaline hydrolysis machine, which is in New York, there's no law prohibiting it, but there's no specific law that says it's legal. Again, gray area. There's a couple of states that have not allowed it, and then some states that have formally allowed it. I don't know of any providers in New York State, but it's something that'll probably happen or develop. Like I mentioned, about half of all people now choose cremation, and this is a greener alternative to cremation, to heat cremation. So now I'm going to move on to the idea of conservation burial grounds or conservation cemeteries. And really, it's basically taking those green burial principles and taking it on a larger scale. Like, can we use collectively, say, people dying and wanting to have natural burials, and use that to preserve or enhance natural properties? So there's a number of ways this happens. Like here, this is a map of all the locations in New York State that allow green burial. So a lot of them are traditional cemeteries that have some parts of the cemetery that have concrete vaults and typical caskets. And then they also have a section like in Rosendale, that would be the closest to many of us here. There's a natural burial section. So I can zoom in on that map. The closest to folks in the Hudson Valley, there's one in Rosendale, which has a natural burial section as part. It's a wooded area, and then there's also like a grassy area that allows natural burials, or it's a space for natural burials. And then there's also a natural burial ground in Rhinebeck. And actually, the one in Rhinebeck is run by a woman, Suzanne Kelly, who's actually she's an author and has written a book about greening death. So she's someone I've spoken to and is very knowledgeable. And she is running it. It's at the Rhinebeck Public Cemetery. So there's a green section there. And I can get into costs. I talked to Rosendale Cemetery. It's $1,500 for a plot and another $1,000 for opening and closing the plot. And you can, of course, call folks and you can buy plots. But I didn't want to get into too many details that because things could change. But according to the person I spoke to in Rosendale, there's plenty of room. So I will mention that I'm a board member on the Wallkill Valley Land Trust. And the Land Trust is a nonprofit that protects and manages open spaces, trails, and farms. We have a number of public easements, conservation easements, and we also manage the Wallkill Valley Rail Trail, and we own Jopenberg Mountain and have these spaces to protect green space. So I did pitch to the rest folks on the board, what about us developing a conservation burial ground? Can we, and because it's something that is done across the country, but there's none in New York State. And basically it's a natural burial site, but with the specific goal and mission to enhance and preserve habitat. So what, my idea was that we identify property that someone has and they want it to be protected. And this would in a way provide a way for it to be protected and to maintain access for people. So either creating a new habitat or protecting existing habitat without disrupting it too much. And that's the only pitch. So this is at another conservation burial ground. They're usually nonprofits and really great community efforts, which I think help people in the process of grieving. You know, I'm guessing folks here have been to funerals, but sometimes they can be cold. The last one I went to, you know, there's the sound of the backhoe and excavator digging up and replacing soil, and it all felt very mechanized. And I think bringing a bit of nature and maybe a slowness can help folks and is really healing. So that's why I have an interest in this and possibly developing a conservation burial ground. There's other ones that combine conservation burial grounds with nature trails, which I think is very interesting. And that is pretty much the end of my presentation. We can open it up to questions and answers and a discussion, but I figured I'd leave you with a short list of what I think are actionable items. You know, I think first having conversations with people you know and love, that especially the ones that will be remaining. Well, we never know when we're going to go, but they're the ones that will be left with the decision. And like I mentioned, you want to see ways you can reduce their burden, but also help you fulfill your wishes, and see maybe if you can provide more benefit to the earth with your body. There's a number of books and resources. I can share those with you. Then the other thing is legal arrangements. And number 4, as I mentioned, if you're in New York State, you need a licensed funeral director to deal with your body and all transport and disposition. And then if you're interested in a home burial, I think calling your town clerk to see if it's allowed, if you have a property, or if you have access to a property. And if you're interested in a natural burial, you could go ahead and buy a plot at Rosendale Cemetery or another one of the cemeteries. And if you're interested in a conservation burial ground, talk to your local land trust, or if you're in the Wallkill Valley, feel free to contact me or our executive director, Christy. And that's what I have. So I'm hoping there's questions, and even better if there's any additions or corrections to anything I presented.
I have a number of questions.
Uh-oh, that's Lee.
You want me to just fire them at you? You can give a quick answer.
I will hope to have the answer, and if not, I will try to get back to you. But let's see.
Okay. Is it is it true that a grave has to be dug 6 feet?
It's not true. The 6 foot, this is great. It's a question I can answer. 6 feet came about when there was a lot of grave robbing happening, and it evolved out after that. The actual, for natural decomposition, the preferred depth is 3 feet. Yeah. So what 3 feet will prevent is from animals from digging you up. But as you know, Lee, there's a lot of active microbes within the top layers of Earth, so you'll get the most fastest decomposition.
Right.
So 3 feet is what's recommended.
Okay. The composting, the business that does the composting.
Yeah.
The bones don't compost in that amount of time, do they?
They become, I think they sift out the bones. I think there's a longer period.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the water burial, do they put a weight on the person?
Yeah, you're required to have a weight. You can be in a coffin, it needs to have holes and a weight. And yes, that's one of the requirements is having a weight, so you don't
want to surprise anybody
and freak people out, right?
I'm just curious, the woven basket, the wicker basket, how much do those cost?
They vary. I mean, like anything. But when I looked at prices, they were more expensive than I thought. They were about $1,000 or $1,500. If you start weaving today, you probably, and harvest your own willow, you could do it for less.
Well, as I said, you didn't mention it explicitly, but this would be part of it. That my idea would be dig a hole, put some wood chips in it, put the body in, put wood chips in, put soil on top, and then That'd be
Actually,
it.
the greater the airflow they're finding, and actually the wicker baskets, from what I've read, actually having that airspace around the body aids in the decomposition.
What's the rush?
Yeah, there's that question too. And I was going to say the big difference between composting and the natural burial is about speed. So if you're under the ground, there really is no question of speed. So
right. Well, as one who does a lot of composting, that's my chosen method.
Matthew has his hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for doing this. Your presentation was excellent. I operate the only crematory in Ulster County. I'm at Wiltwick Cemetery in Kingston. And just wanted to share a couple of points, or just build on a couple of points that you mentioned. You're correct about the cremation rate being approximately 50%. That's a nationwide rate.
Yep.
Here in the Hudson Valley, we're actually at 72%. We're climbing every year. More and more people are choosing cremation. I agree with you that cremation is a greener solution than a traditional burial. But like you said, it's not, there's no perfect solution here, in my opinion. And cremation does use fossil fuels. The alkaline hydrolysis, the water cremation that you referred to, we approached New York State Division of Cemeteries and tried to get permission. We looked into alkaline hydrolysis. There's a lot of problems with that process as well. There is a liquid that needs to be disposed of after the completion of water cremation. And nobody has a good solution for what to do with that. Where that exists, they're actually flushing that fluid into the public sewer system. Oh. So that's your loved one that you're introducing into a public sewer system. There is a couple organizations, one that I visited out in Colorado, where they are utilizing that liquid as a liquid compost. But New York State has not addressed that at all. You're correct that they did legalize in New York State compost facilities. Those regulations are still being developed by New York State Division of Cemeteries. They won't authorize any compost facilities until those regulations are in place. And it's not going well. They're developing those regulations, but because they have proven that there are some communicable diseases that do not go away, for lack of a better word, with the composting, the draft version of those regulations right now, the state has come out with that compost must remain on a cemetery property and must be buried. And the only solution to that is to dig a grave and to bury the compost, which, in my opinion, completely defeats the purpose. I know Katrina's in on those conversations, and I've spoken to her several times about it. So we're still kind of at the starting line with human composting. Alkaline hydrolysis hasn't even made it to the starting line yet in New York State. But I just wanted to share that information with you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you again. Your
That's
talk
really
was
helpful, especially with the alkaline hydrolysis. I couldn't find clarity on whether it was allowed. And
what I had proposed to the state when the other problem, just to back up for 1 second, is that the human composting and alkaline hydrolysis, human composting, when we started working the numbers on it, our initial investment here in Kingston would have been $1.4 million. That's a lot of bodies that we would have to. A cemetery is a business, so we need to invest our funds wisely so that we're here forever. And alkaline hydrolysis, those machines are starting at about $400,000 each. So they're also very cost prohibitive, and it's going to be difficult for someone to get something like that off the ground. But I'm a big supporter of Katrina's and the work that she's doing.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alan.
Great talk. I have a comment and a question. My comment is, cemeteries are beloved by birders because they're quiet, and they're great places to see shy birds. So anything that keeps them green is a good idea. As for home burial, that's not a new idea. Obviously, the pioneers did a lot of burying on grounds, but the question is, what happens when the house gets sold?
Right.
We have sort of an interesting issue in Marbletown. There is a private home that has what we believe is an old black slave cemetery on its grounds. And there's a lot of discussion about what should be done with this spot. But have you seen anything when you were looking at the law on?
Yeah. Yeah, so typically I mentioned an easement. So you would have a family burial plot. If it's on your own property, you would be required to have an easement as part of your deed. So, which meant that that part of your property, just like a conservation easement, someone couldn't develop, put their garage
in perpetuity.
perpetuity. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But when talking to town clerks, or even the funeral director, he said that doesn't always happen. People just have plots on their land where their family's been buried with no easement. So technically, you're supposed to have some kind of cemetery easement that's noted as part of your deed.
And family members could then sue if a subsequent owner decided to develop that particular area.
Yeah, exactly like a conservation easement. But as you would know, in the past, I think documents weren't filed, and typically people would bury their loved ones on their property, if
Right.
not, say a church grounds or a community cemetery. But it was the norm to bury your loved ones on your property. So,
Well, New York is still discovering where the slave cemeteries are, and it's an issue,
right,
as you probably are aware of.
no. Michael.
Yeah, it was a great talk, very informative. Thank you. 2 points come to mind for me. You talked about buying plots at both Rosendale and Rhinecliff.
Mhm.
So I'm assuming that if you're buying the plot, that it's your plot forevermore and nobody will be buried and that won't be used for anybody else, which I thought was part of the whole, value of this, that we're not taking up more and more land for people that at some point the earth runs out of space, which is, hard to imagine, but,
Yeah,
so-
the value of buying a plot in a conservation or a natural cemetery is that it's a plot that doesn't require disturbance of ground or clearing of land or removal of trees. It's an area that has open space. So it's not, those sites are not like the typical modern cemetery where it's just all lawn. So you still have a plot. It's just less disruptive. No chemicals are used. No pesticides are used on the property. And they're
So
not.
could a family member be buried in the same plot after a period of years or some period of time?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question.
Matthew
I
shaking
think
his
they're
head
not.
no.
So in New York State, once a plot of any type, whether it's traditional cemetery or a what we're discussing, green burial type, the answer is no. If that plot is not used, so let's assume for a second that you bought an area that the cemetery has decided is large enough for 2 people. In New York State, after 75 years, if those spaces are not used, the cemetery can resell them. Most cemeteries don't do that, but it is part of the law that can be done. I would encourage you to also just consider just one thing. So the Rosendale Plains Cemetery and Rhinebeck public cemetery. They are both, and the map that you showed on your presentation, that's all from the Green Burial Council. Green Burial Council is doing excellent work. We've considered becoming a part of them. My hesitation was that it's simply very expensive. Green Burial Council is very good, but they're also very good at marketing. And if someone is interested in green burial, I'd encourage you to talk to your local cemetery, because it's not just the cemeteries identified on that map that are offering green burials. In my cemetery here in Kingston, we offer what we honestly refer to as a greener burial. That's correct. You do not have to be embalmed. You do not have to be in a casket. You can be in a traditional cemetery. So there is still lawn maintenance and things like that. But people can choose to have greener burials without going the additional expense of some of the other options.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So my second point, thank you, Matthew. My second point has to do with formaldehyde. So I'm guessing that if a person is having a green burial, they're not being filled with formaldehyde. So does that limit the time frame for the possibility of a wake? I guess it would.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the body starts to, and Matthew could answer this better than I could, but there is a bloating and decomposition process. I mean, the whole point of formaldehyde is to preserve the body and prevent those things from happening. So, yeah.
I agree. That's accurate. And that's a discussion to have with the funeral director. And my understanding is that is the deciding factor there is the health of the person when they passed away. You know, rapid decline versus a lengthy illness. And then again, what the family wants to do. If a family is not interested in having viewing, then it really becomes, in my opinion, difficult to justify embalming.
And Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are options for less harmful chemicals in embalming.
That is also my understanding. Yes, there are other options available. Still, again, it's not a perfect solution. They still have their negatives attributed to them. And most funeral directors that I'm aware of are now using the greenest options available, because like you pointed out, the chemicals that they used in years past were also very harmful to funeral directors, to embalmers.
Thank you. Other questions? Anybody have any other questions?
Somebody just put a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Barbara here. I'm going to interpret my question because there are a couple of typos. Just wondering whether in your research you came across any data on negative effects on soils or groundwater from the burial of human remains.
Yeah, I was preparing for that question.
We have mercury in our dental fillings. I don't know how soluble that is and how quickly that gets released, but we also have, synthetic organic chemicals, pesticides, pollutants in our tissues, which are going to get released and hopefully acted on by microbial populations. But has anybody looked at that?
Yeah, there are people, and again, I would defer to Matthew, but from what I've looked at is that, I don't want to say negligible, especially in the context of PFAS, the forever chemicals, but the amount of, we'll say, harmful chemicals in your body, including mercury, which is a natural element, and it's the amount in your body that would leach into soil is, I don't want to say minuscule, but not significant. I mean, then that would vary person to person. You know, and Matthew, I would defer to you because from what I can tell, it's just what I've read is that it's not a huge issue.
In all of my reading, I have not come across anything where it is been a serious issue. Even cemeteries that are located, you know, directly over an aquifer or next to bodies of water, it's just not something that I guess I can speak. I'm not an expert on that subject, but it's not something I've come across in my reading that's been an issue.
And as you referred to, is once the microbes get working, often they break down compounds. You know, the fungi and other bacteria do break down harmful compounds into their elements. So decomposition with soil is probably the best bet, unless it's something extreme like I was mentioning PFAS, forever chemicals.
Okay, any other questions?
I might have another question. So what would be the difference between the green burial ground at the Rosendale, the current green burial ground at the Rosendale Cemetery, and the conservation burial ground that you're imagining?
Yeah, so it's similar ideas. I mean, the green burial ground at the Rosendale Cemetery already exists. What I would be proposing is to preserve more natural areas, and then the fact that the land trust is focused on restoration of areas, elimination of invasive species and creation of new habitat, and has a volunteer base. So it would be a similar thing, but just more, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess that's about it. Arif, thanks again. It was an excellent presentation.